The fog was so thick that morning a man couldn't see beyond 10 paces. December 2nd, 1805, fields of Moravia. The fate of Europe would be decided before noon. Napoleon Bonaparte, the military genius who had conquered Italy and Egypt, now seemed trapped like a rat in a corner. 73,000 exhausted French soldiers faced 85,000 fresh Austro-Russian troops, hungry for revenge. His position was weak, his right flank barely defended, his lines dangerously stretched. The enemy emperors smiled from their hills, certain the Corsican would finally be crushed. But in the next few minutes, you'll see how what looked like desperation was actually the most brilliant deception ever conceived. To understand how we reached this moment, we need to rewind just 3 months. Europe was ablaze. The Third Coalition, a massive alliance between Austria, Russia, Great Britain, Sweden, and Naples, had formed with a single objective: destroy France and chain the young emperor threatening the old order. Napoleon had been crowned barely a year earlier, in December 1804, and the traditional monarchies couldn't tolerate a Corsican soldier proclaiming himself emperor. The Allied plan was simple and devastating. While the British fleet blockaded French coasts, massive armies would converge from the east. Austria would mobilize 95,000 men. Russia would send 150,000 soldiers in successive waves. Sweden would attack from the north, Naples from the south. It was a perfect encirclement, designed by Europe's most experienced military minds. But Napoleon wasn't an ordinary commander. At 36 years old, he'd revolutionized modern warfare. While other generals thought in terms of sieges and formal battles, he thought in speed, surprise, and total annihilation. His Grande Armée wasn't simply an army, it was a perfectly synchronized war machine. Each corps could move independently, but coordinate with deadly precision. The campaign began with a masterstroke. In October, before the Russians could join their Austrian allies, Napoleon marched 200,000 men from the English Channel to the heart of Germany in just 2 weeks. A logistical feat that left military observers speechless. General Mack's Austrian army, awaiting Russian reinforcements, was surrounded at Ulm. 33,000 soldiers surrendered with barely a fight. The first phase of the campaign had ended in total victory. But the real challenge was just beginning. Tsar Alexander III of Russia, young, impetuous, and hungry for glory, was marching westward with 75,000 veterans. He joined Emperor Francis II of Austria, who had rallied the remnants of his army, another 15,000 men. Together, they commanded 90,000 soldiers. Napoleon, after weeks of forced marches and combat, barely retained 73,000 men in fighting condition. By the way, this story reaches you in English, the language that connects continents and cultures from London to Sydney, from New York to Mumbai. I'm curious, from which corner of the English-speaking world are you listening? America, Britain, Australia, India, Canada. Each battle resonates differently in every land. The Allies had every advantage: numerical superiority, fresh troops, secure supply lines, and most importantly, they occupied the strategic high ground. The Pratzen Heights dominated the entire battlefield. From there, artillery could massacre any force that advanced. The Austro-Russian commanders met in war council, radiating confidence. General Mikhail Kutuzov, veteran of 50 battles, was the only one showing caution. He'd faced Turks, Poles, and French. He knew war like others, no breathing. Napoleon doesn't make mistakes without reason, he warned the Tsar. If he appears weak, it's probably a trap. Let's wait for reinforcements. Time favors us. But Alexander I, barely 28 years old, burned with impatience. He dreamed of personal glory, of being Europe's liberator, of humiliating the upstart Corsican who dared challenge millennium-old empires. Napoleon knew his enemy's psychology perfectly. He'd studied the young Tsar, his ambitions, his pride, his impatience. And now, with surgical precision, he would offer exactly what he most desired: an easy, glorious victory. But what the Allies didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that they were walking directly into the most brilliant trap ever conceived in military history. On the French side, Napoleon Bonaparte was a force of nature compressed into a 516 frame. At 36, he'd transformed European warfare. Born in Corsica, rejected by French aristocracy for his humble origins, he'd risen through pure military genius. In 7 years, he'd gone from artillery captain to Emperor of France. Italy, Egypt, Austria, all had tasted his tactical brilliance. But Austerlitz would be his absolute masterpiece. His Grande Armée was revolutionary. While other armies marched in slow masses, Napoleon had created the independent corps system. Each corps, commanded by a marshal, could move, fight, and sustain itself alone, yet coordinate at the decisive moment. His marshals were living legends. Soult, the tactical brain. Lanz, the lion of infantry. Murat, the cavalry king with his impossible uniforms and suicidal charges. Davout, the iron warrior, incorruptible and lethal. Together they formed the most talented staff ever assembled. Facing them, the coalition presented a fascinating contrast. General Mikhail Kutuzov, 60 years old, was everything Alexander the Rough wasn't: patient, cautious, wise. He'd lost an eye fighting the Turks. His scars told stories of 5 decades of war. He knew the price of heroism and the value of patience. But his advice was systematically ignored by the young Tsar who'd appointed him commander only through political pressure. Alexander III of Russia represented everything dangerous about power without experience. Handsome, charismatic, educated by Enlightenment philosophers, he believed war was a matter of courage and numbers. He'd never commanded troops in combat. Surrounded by flattering courtiers who assured him Napoleon was simply a lucky general, the Tsar saw Austerlitz as his opportunity to prove greatness. Emperor Francis II of Austria, more experienced after his defeat at Ulm, watched with growing unease his allies' excessive confidence. The forces reflected this dynamic. On the French side, 73,000 veterans hardened by years of campaigning. Each soldier had marched from the Channel to Moravia, 500 miles in weeks. They were tired, yes, but also hardened, disciplined, and fanatically loyal to their emperor. The Imperial Guard Grenadiers, the Immortals, had never known defeat. Murat's cuirassiers could shatter any line. French artillery, Europe's best, could fire 3 times faster than any rival. The Austro-Russians gathered 85,000 men, perhaps even 90,000 according to some sources. Russian soldiers were brutal war machines, trained to endure punishment that would break other armies. The Austrians, though demoralized by Ulm, remained competent professionals. Cossack cavalry, unpredictable but lethal, prowled the flanks. But this massive army suffered a fatal problem. 2 emperors, multiple generals, no real unified command. The terrain would be the silent arbiter of battle. Pratzen Heights dominated the field like a clenched fist. An elevated plateau, 650 feet above the surrounding plain, from where artillery could reach every corner of the valley. Whoever controlled Pratzen controlled the battle. The Allies occupied it with force. To the south, a series of frozen lakes, Zachen, Menitz. To the north, lesser hills and the vital road to Brunn, the French retreat line. If this masterful strategy is fascinating you, imagine what's coming in the next few minutes. Hit that like button, subscribe to Battle Depot, and ring that bell because what Napoleon does next defies all conventional military logic. This story is just beginning to reveal its darkest secrets. On the night of December the 1st, Napoleon gathered his marshals in his command tent. By candlelight, he spread detailed terrain maps. What he revealed stunned them. "Gentlemen," he said with that unsettling calm that preceded his boldest strikes, "tomorrow we'll hand Pratzen to the enemy. We'll weaken our right flank until it appears ready to collapse. The Allies won't resist temptation. They'll descend from the heights to surround and destroy us." Soult, understanding instantly, smiled. "And when their center is empty?" Napoleon nodded. "We take Pratzen, cut their army in 2, and destroy them piece by piece." It was madness. It was brilliance. It was Napoleon. December the 2nd, 1805, dawned with fog so thick that men looked like ghosts moving through clouds. Visibility didn't exceed 20 yards. French soldiers, shivering in their positions, could barely see their comrades. This fog, which would enter legend as the Fog of Austerlitz, was the perfect ally for what Napoleon had planned. It would hide his movements, disguise his real numbers, and amplify enemy confusion. At 6 a.m., the first Austro-Russian columns began moving. The Allied plan was elegant in its simplicity. 4 massive columns, totaling 40,000 men, would descend from Pratzen Heights toward the south. They'd attack the weak French right flank, roll it up like a carpet, cut Napoleon's retreat to Vienna, and trap the entire French army against the frozen lakes. Total annihilation seemed inevitable. Napoleon watched from a lesser hill to the north, surrounded by his staff. Through his telescope, he saw shadows moving in the fog. Each Allied column descending was another piece of his puzzle falling into place. Soult, beside him, nervously consulted his watch. "Sire, when do we give the order?" Napoleon, motionless as a statue, replied with deadly calm. "Not yet. They must commit completely. 1 minute early would be hasty. 1 minute late would be too late." On the French right flank, Marshal Davout held position with barely 6,000 men against the approaching avalanche. His soldiers could hear the thunder of thousands of boots, the creak of artillery wheels, shouts in Russian. It seemed hell itself was descending upon them. But Davout, the most disciplined of marshals, maintained formation. His orders were clear: resist, retreat slowly, but never break. Make it look like genuine desperation, not calculated deception. Meanwhile, something extraordinary was happening on Pratzen Heights. French troops who'd occupied positions there during the night began withdrawing. Not in battle order, but in apparent panic. They abandoned burning campfires, baggage, even some damaged cannons. Austrian soldiers observing from higher positions reported jubilantly, "The French are fleeing. Pratzen is almost empty." General Kutuzov, watching this development, felt a chill run down his spine. Something was wrong. Napoleon didn't abandon strategic positions in panic. The veteran rode to where Tsar Alexander stood, surrounded by his brilliant retinue of young officers. "Your Imperial Majesty," Kutuzov pleaded, "this is too convenient. Napoleon is inviting us to overextend. We must keep Pratzen strongly held, not empty it to chase his flank." But Alexander the Fawn, his eyes shining with certainty of triumph, dismissed the concerns. "General Kutuzov, your caution is admirable but unnecessary. Can't you see? Bonaparte is defeated. His flank crumbles, he abandons the heights. This is our moment of glory." The young officers surrounding him echoed his enthusiasm. Prince Dolgorukov, who'd negotiated with Napoleon days before and found him nervous and weak, insisted, "The Corsican is finished. We just need the final blow." Order after order flowed from Allied command. More troops must descend from Pratzen. General Przebishevsky would lead his column south. Langeron would follow. Doktorov would cover the center. Kolovrath would maintain the reserve. In total, nearly 60,000 men were now committed to the southward movement, leaving barely 15,000 defending the crucial heights. The Allied army stretched like a man reaching for something shiny at a cliff's edge, unaware he was about to fall. Russian columns smashed into Davout's defenses at 8 a.m. Combat was brutal. Russian grenadiers, shouting, "Hurrah!" charged with fixed bayonets. French artillery responded with canister at point-blank range. Men fell in waves, but Russians kept coming. Davout yielded ground meter by meter, exactly as Napoleon had ordered. Each minute he resisted was another minute of Allied troops committing to the attack, another minute of Pratzen becoming vulnerable. At 8:30, Napoleon closed his telescope. The fog was beginning to lift. He could now see clearly. Allied columns were fully extended, their rear exposed, their center almost empty. He turned to Soult with a smile his veterans knew well, the tiger's smile before the leap. "How long do you need to take Pratzen?" Soult replied without hesitation. 20 minutes, sire." Napoleon nodded. "Then go, and may God help anyone who stands in your way." At 9 a.m., something happened that witnesses would describe as divine intervention. The fog, that thick curtain concealing the field for hours, began lifting like a theater curtain. And then it appeared, brilliant and golden, the winter sun. Its rays illuminated the battlefield with merciless clarity, revealing the horror the Allies had committed. Their columns were completely extended, vulnerable, exposed. And marching toward Pratzen Heights in perfect formation came 16,000 French soldiers from Soult's corps. The attack was devastating in its precision. Saint-Hilaire and Vendôme's divisions ascended the slope in two massive columns, bayonets gleaming in sunlight. French artillery, expertly positioned, began hammering Allied positions. Russian defenders, barely 4,000 men caught completely by surprise, attempted forming battle lines. Too late. French columns struck like hammers. Saint-Hilaire's veterans, screaming "Vive l'Empereur!" crashed into Russian grenadiers in brutal hand-to-hand combat. For 15 minutes, the heights were hell of steel and gunpowder. Bayonets found flesh. Sabers cut bone. Muskets fired point-blank, powder burning enemy faces. But the outcome was never in doubt. Napoleon had concentrated superior force at the decisive point. By 9:30, the French tricolor flew over Pratzen Heights. The heart of the battlefield, the position Allies had so confidently abandoned, now belonged to France. General Kutuzov, watching from his position, felt his heart sink. Everything he'd feared was materializing before his eyes. The Allied army was now cut in two. Columns that had marched south were isolated, without retreat line. Tsar Alexander, finally comprehending the disaster's magnitude, paled. "How is this possible?" he whispered repeatedly. "How didn't we see it coming?" The young emperor who dreamed of glory now faced the nightmare of total annihilation. But Napoleon wasn't finished. With Pratzen secured, he unleashed his other marshals. To the north, Lannes and Murat received the signal. 8,000 riders of French heavy cavalry, cuirassiers in armor and gleaming helmets, dragoons with their green plumes, began forming. Marshal Murat, dressed in his ridiculous and magnificent uniform of feathers and gold, unsheathed his saber. "Gentlemen of France, follow me to immortality." Earth trembled under thousands of hooves as the charge began. Allied cavalry tried responding, but was disorganized, scattered. French cuirassiers tore through them like a hammer shatters glass. Entire squadrons of Austrian hussars were trampled. Cossack cavalry, usually so fearsome, fled before the attack's fury. Lannes, commanding infantry, pushed forward without mercy. The Allied northern flank disintegrated in minutes. Thousands of Austro-Russian soldiers began fleeing eastward, abandoning artillery, standards, all pretense of order. To the south, Russian columns that had attacked Davout were now trapped. Soult, from Pratzen, sent divisions down the southern slope, attacking them from the rear. Davout, reinforced by Friant's division, counterattacked from the front. Russians fought with desperate courage. General Przebishevsky tried organizing an orderly retreat, but it was too late. His men were surrounded on three sides. The fourth side was the frozen lakes. What happened at Lake Sachsen and Menitz would become Austerlitz's most horrific image. Thousands of panicked Russian soldiers tried escaping across the ice. French artillery, positioned on the shores, began firing not at the men, but at the ice itself. 12-pound cannonballs struck the frozen surface with seismic impact. Cracks appeared. Ice began yielding. Then came the sound, a massive cracking like the world's end. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of men fell into freezing water. The weight of their uniforms, packs, and weapons dragged them down. Terror screams drowned in gurgles. Comrades tried helping and also fell. Horses, cannons, everything disappeared under black water. French witnesses, even hardened veterans, looked away. It was massacre, not battle. Napoleon himself, watching from Pratzen, murmured, "Let this end soon." But it continued until the last enemy soldier had surrendered or fled. By 4 p.m., 9 hours after dawn, the Battle of Austerlitz had ended. Numbers told a story of unprecedented disaster. Allies lost 27,000 men, 15,000 dead, 12,000 captured, 180 cannons, 50 battle standards, all military credibility, French losses, 9,000 men, devastating but manageable. The ratio was obscene, 3 allies dead for every Frenchman. Emperor Francis II of Austria, humiliated, sent emissaries that same night. He begged for armistice. Alexander the Firm, psychologically shattered, ordered immediate retreat to Russia. The young Tsar who'd arrived seeking glory departed destroyed, a brutal lesson on the difference between ambition and competence. Austerlitz's consequences shook Europe to its foundations. 3 days after the battle, December 5th, Austria signed the armistice. On December 26th came the Treaty of Pressburg, one of history's most humiliating. Austria lost Venice, Dalmatia, Istria, Tyrol. They paid massive indemnities. They recognized Napoleon as King of Italy. The Holy Roman Empire, that 1,000-year medieval relic, formally dissolved in 1806. Russia retreated to its borders, its army shattered. The Third Coalition had collapsed in 9 hours of combat. Napoleon reached the absolute pinnacle of his power. His soldiers called him the Son of Austerlitz, comparing him to Louis XIV, the Sun King. But Napoleon had achieved in years what the Bourbons took centuries to build. At 36, he controlled France, Italy, Holland, much of Germany, and Switzerland. Kings trembled at his name. His brothers were crowned on foreign thrones. Joseph in Naples, Louis in Holland, later Jerome in Westphalia. The Bonaparte dynasty was replacing ancient royal houses like falling dominoes. But why did it work so perfectly? Austerlitz's genius resided in the lethal combination of psychology, terrain, and timing. Napoleon understood Alexander then was young, impatient, hungry for glory. He offered exactly the trap his personality couldn't resist: an easy, quick victory. He used terrain as a weapon, turning the Allied advantage of the heights into their doom by making them abandon it. Timing was perfect, waiting until enemy columns were fully committed before striking the exposed center. The battle demonstrated military principles still valid today. Concentration of force at the decisive point. Economy of means, using the minimum necessary on secondary flanks to maximize power at the center. Exploitation of victories, giving the enemy no time to reorganize. Perfect coordination between arms, infantry, cavalry, and artillery working as a single organism. Strategic deception, making apparent weakness become hidden strength. Compared to other great tactical victories, Austerlitz stands out. Hannibal's Cannae achieved greater annihilation rate, but against a less sophisticated enemy. Henry V's Agincourt achieved victory against greater numerical superiority, but was primarily defensive. Waterloo would be larger in scale, but also more chaotic and less elegant. Austerlitz represented the pinnacle of Napoleonic warfare, where everything went exactly according to plan. Military academies worldwide still study Austerlitz as an example of perfect battle. West Point, Sandhurst, Saint-Cyr all dissect every movement. Principles apply even in modern warfare. Deceive the enemy about intentions, attack where enemy is weak, maintain reserves to exploit success. Commanders from Moltke to Patton studied the lessons of that cold December morning. But victory contained the seeds of Napoleon's destruction. Austerlitz convinced him of his own invincibility. The triumph's ease fed fatal arrogance. If 73,000 could destroy 85,000, what couldn't he accomplish? This overconfidence led him to invade Spain, where 300,000 French bogged down in endless guerrilla war. It led him to Russia in 1812, where 600,000 men entered and barely 100,000 returned. It led him to underestimate Wellington at Waterloo. Austerlitz's brilliance became his curse, making him believe genius would always triumph over reality. The deepest lesson transcends military matters. Austerlitz demonstrates that in conflict, intellect can overcome brute force. That meticulous preparation defeats confident improvisation. That understanding opponent's psychology is worth as much as counting his soldiers. Napoleon didn't have more cannons or more men, but he had a better plan, better execution, and iron will to risk everything in one decisive moment. If this epic tale of military genius has fascinated you, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button, subscribe to Battle Depot, and leave a comment telling me which country you're watching from. Every battle tells differently depending on who listens. And if you want more stories where the impossible becomes reality, where human ingenuity rewrites destiny, explore our other videos. History is full of moments where everything seemed lost until someone refused to accept it. In 9 hours, a short Corsican proved that in war, brain will always defeat brawn. That superior numbers mean nothing without superior strategy. That true victory begins in the commander's mind, not on the field. 73,000 French defeated 85,000 Austro-Russians because their leader saw the entire chessboard while his enemies only saw individual pieces. Austerlitz wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass on how human genius, focused and ruthless, can bend reality to its will. The sun that had revealed Napoleon's triumph now set over a field transformed into hell on earth. As darkness fell on December 2nd, 1805, the true cost of genius became visible. Bodies carpeted the ground from Pratzen Heights to the frozen lakes. The wounded, French and Allied alike, screamed for water, for their mothers, for death. Medical corps, overwhelmed by sheer numbers, worked through the night by torchlight. This was the price of military perfection. French Sergeant Jean-Roch Coignet left us his account. We walked among the dead and dying. Russians who'd been so confident that morning now lay frozen in their blood. I saw a young Austrian officer, couldn't have been more than 20, clutching a miniature portrait of a woman. His last thought was of home. These weren't statistics. These were sons, fathers, brothers. Glory always demands payment in flesh. Russian Lieutenant Langeron, who survived the disaster, wrote, "The ice breaking beneath us sounded like artillery fire. Men grabbed at anything, anyone. I saw a general's horse drag him down into black water. The weight of his medals and decorations became an anchor. In minutes, hundreds vanished beneath the surface. Their bodies wouldn't be recovered until spring thaw." The morning of December 3rd brought grim reality. Local Moravian peasants pressed into service spent weeks burying bodies. Mass graves were dug on Pratzen Heights. Russian dead, Austrian dead, French dead, all went into the same earth. The frozen lakes presented a unique horror. When ice finally melted months later, bloated corpses surfaced. Some historians estimate up to 2,000 men drowned in those lakes, though exact numbers remain unknown. Napoleon toured the battlefield that morning, accompanied by his marshals. His face, usually so animated, was pale and drawn. One night on a battlefield, he reportedly said, "does more to destroy the soul than a month of political intrigue." Even for a man who'd seen countless battles, Austerlitz's scale of slaughter was sobering. He ordered extra rations for the wounded, regardless of nationality. It was the least he could do. The diplomatic aftermath moved swiftly. Emperor Francis II arrived at Napoleon's headquarters in Austerlitz town on December 4th. Contemporary accounts describe him as broken, aged 10 years in 3 days. The negotiations were brief. Austria had no leverage. Napoleon dictated terms. Francis signed everything. When asked how he felt, the Austrian emperor simply replied, "humiliated, but alive." Tsar Alexander III's psychological collapse was complete. Prince Adam Czartoryski, his close advisor, wrote, "The Tsar who left St. Petersburg was full of confidence and dreams. The man who returned was hollow, haunted. He couldn't speak of Austerlitz without visible distress. The defeat scarred him deeper than any physical wound could." Alexander would spend years rebuilding Russian military doctrine, determined never to face such humiliation again. For the soldiers who survived, Austerlitz became the defining moment of their lives. Veterans would begin stories with, "At Austerlitz, I..." French soldiers received the unprecedented honor of having Austerlitz engraved on their regimental standards. The wounded received pensions. The dead were honored with monuments. Napoleon understood that glory must be shared to maintain loyalty. The battlefield itself became hallowed ground. Within months, monuments appeared. The French erected a memorial on Pratzen Heights. Local churches held masses for the fallen. Farmers plowing fields for decades afterward would unearth buttons, buckles, musket balls, fragments of lives violently ended. Even today, metal detector enthusiasts find relics from that terrible day. Military historians conducting staff rides still walk Pratzen Heights, tracing troop movements, explaining how terrain influenced decisions. The village of Austerlitz, now Slavkov u Brna in Czech Republic, hosts annual commemorations. Reenactors in period uniforms recreate the battle, though without the blood, screams, and death that made the original so horrific. Perhaps the most touching aftermath involved ordinary soldiers on both sides recognizing shared humanity. French guards shared brandy with wounded Russians. Austrian surgeons treated French wounded. In the days after battle, before prisoners were marched away, there were moments of kindness amid catastrophe. War's brutality couldn't completely extinguish human compassion. Austerlitz proved that even perfect victory comes with terrible cost. Napoleon won everything he wanted, militarily and politically. But the 9,000 French families who received death notifications didn't celebrate. The price of imperial ambition was always paid by those who had no say in its prosecution. That's the lesson military academies rarely teach. Behind every tactical masterpiece lie thousands of personal tragedies.